Welcome everyone to another edition of the Classic Comic Archive, a series where I recap and review many of Marvel Comics' most seminal early issues. Our story for today is Incredible Hulk 1, cover dated May of 1962. This issue marks the first appearance of the Hulk, as well as several of his supporting characters, including General Thunderbolt Ross, Betty Ross, and Rick Jones. The issue was written by Stan Lee and drawn by Jack Kirby. Our story opens up with a striking splash page, teasing the coming arrival of the Incredible Hulk. But to understand how the Grey Goliath came to be, we must first travel to an isolated army testing range, where an experimental gamma bomb is about to be detonated. Waiting anxiously from a distant bunker is Dr. Bruce Banner, the brilliant scientist who designed the bomb. But its actual construction was a team effort, as he was assisted by a group of fellow scientists. But some design aspects were kept hidden from them, including the very nature of the bomb's epic power. One of these scientists, a man named Igor, resents this about Banner, as he doesn't think that the creation of such a dangerous weapon should be entrusted to a single man. But less cautious is General Thunderbolt Ross, the testing site's commanding officer. He's only concerned with deadlines and efficiency, and has been frustrated with the gamma bomb's many delays. He blames them on Banner, and has come to see him as a weak and ineffectual man. But one of Banner's few defenders is the General's own daughter, Betty Ross. She reminds her father that he's one of the world's most renowned scientists, and therefore any delays must have been warranted. While the prideful General would never admit it, his daughter does have a point, so he begrudgingly shuts up, and steps aside to let Banner continue his preparations. But to the General's pleasant surprise, he's finished them all, and is ready to begin the gamma bomb's detonation countdown. But just before he does, he's taken aside by Igor, who angrily demands to know the secret behind the gamma bomb's epic power. But Banner refuses to tell him, and starts the countdown. Seeing as their bunker is several miles away from the actual bomb, Banner pulls out a pair of binoculars to watch its detonation. But as he's scanning the nearby desert, he notices a teenager cluelessly driving into the testing range. Realizing that he'll perish in the detonation, Banner orders Igor to stop the countdown as he races out to save him. But a jealous Igor sees this as an opportunity to get rid of his rival, so he does nothing, and lets the countdown continue. But the issue then shifts focus back to Banner, who's arrived at the teenager, but has realized that the countdown hasn't stopped. Knowing that they don't have enough time to drive out of the testing range, Banner yanks the teenager out of his car and pushes him into a nearby trench, hoping that it'll shield him from the detonation. But he's not fast enough to dive in himself, as the bomb then explodes and bathes him in gamma radiation. But the issue then shifts forward several hours later, as Banner is waking up from a brief coma within the testing site's infirmary. Monitoring him is a doctor, who is shocked to see that he'd survived the detonation, considering the usually lethal amount of radiation he'd absorbed. Also there is the teenager, who'd brought him in, and now introduces himself as Rick Jones. While he and Banner seem to be in good health, the army has opted to keep them confined in an observation room, in case their exposure to the gamma bomb has any unforeseen side effects. So that's where they remain for the rest of the day. But just as night falls, Banner begins reeling from a sudden headache. Strangely, its onset happens to occur just as a nearby Geiger counter begins picking up an unusual amount of radiation. Nothing in the room is obviously radioactive, except for Banner himself, who's begun transforming into a massive gray monster. It doesn't have the memories of Banner, nor the intelligence, as its first instinct is to crash its way out of the infirmary. It then begins mindlessly wandering through the testing site, where it collides with a group of soldiers driving a jeep. Incredibly, it's completely unharmed by the crash, but still flees into the desert. Trailing behind it is Rick Jones, who feels obligated to help Banner after he'd saved his life, even if he's now a monster. But as one might expect, the army assumes that the strange brute is an intruder, and thus sends out a search party to find, and potentially subdue it. One of these pursuing soldiers dubs it the Hulk, a name that's quickly adopted by the entire base. But back at the infirmary, a group of officers have stumbled onto the crumbling wall that had once contained Rick and Banner. But they don't know that the latter is the Hulk, and thus begin wondering if it had attacked them. But of course the pair weren't attacked, but had simply escaped. Yet something has compelled the Hulk to return to the base, and more specifically to the laboratory of his former self. Evidently he has still retained some of Banner's memories, as he knows his way around the base without being detected. But when he enters the laboratory, he finds it being burglarized by Igor. It turns out that he's actually a Soviet spy, sent there to steal the secret behind the Gamma bomb's epic power. Ignoring his gray skin and massive size, Igor assumes that the Hulk is someone working for the army, and thus pulls out a gun to silence him. But even a shot from point-blank range is harmless to the Hulk. It does, however, anger him, and he snatches away the gun and crushes it with his bare hands. A terrified Igor then decries that the Hulk isn't human, but the brute responds by picking him up and questioning why he'd ever want to be one. He then furiously hurls him onto a nearby table full of lab equipment. The impact knocks him out, and turns over a beaker with a secret report taped underneath. Rick realizes that it contains the Gamma bomb plans that he was after, and comments that it had been written by Bruce Banner. The Hulk vaguely recognizes the name, and then notices a nearby picture of his former self. Its sight enrages him, as it reminds him of the weakling he once was. So he decides to get rid of anything that ties him to his past life, including Rick Jones. But just as it seems that he's about to attack the helpless teenager, he suddenly begins transforming back into Bruce Banner. A few moments later, the back-to-normal scientist happily declares that his nightmare is over. But his troubles have only just begun, as it's then that an army captain and a squad of his soldiers burst into the laboratory to apprehend the Hulk. While they of course don't find him, they do find Igor, and assume that he was working with him. The captain then approaches Banner and accuses him of also being involved. But a pair of nearby soldiers come to his defense, as they were in the jeep that had crashed into the Hulk, and know that he looked nothing like him. In fact, one claims that the Hulk was likely just an escaped zoo gorilla, while the other thinks he's an escaped circus bear. Whatever he may be, the captain doesn't press Banner any further, and then leaves with his soldiers and an apprehended Igor. In their place is Betty Ross, who'd come to apologize for her father's earlier remarks. She offers to help Banner get medical attention, as evidently his shoulder has been injured by the shot that Igor fired at the Hulk. While he's grateful for the offer, he doesn't accept it, and politely asks her to leave. She obliges, allowing him and Rick to discuss the day's events in private. But the childish teenager simply wants to know what it felt like being the Hulk, and is surprised to find that Banner isn't in the talkative mood. He wonders why he's so morose, even though his nightmare is over. But Banner doesn't think it is, as he realizes that his first transformation was triggered by nightfall, which is fast approaching. But the issue then shifts focus to Igor, who's been locked up for his crimes. Yet he's hardly concerned about it, as he's confident that he'll escape within no time. To this end, he activates a hidden communication device pasted onto his thumbnail. It alerts his commander to his imprisonment, and to the emergence of the Hulk. But the commander recognizes the danger that the Hulk might pose to a rescue mission, and thus decides to pass off the news to the one man who might be able to defeat him, the Gargoyle. Yet he wouldn't dare face the menace himself, so he instead hands it off to a series of reluctant officials. Eventually one agrees to deliver it, although he simply slides a note under the Gargoyle's door. Regardless, the menace reads it, and is shocked to learn that there exists a being whose power rivals his own. Thus it's revealed that the Gargoyle is a Soviet scientist who's been hideously mutated, but gifted with incredible intellect. He quickly becomes obsessed with defeating the Hulk, forgets all about Igor, and orders for a submarine to be immediately readied for departure. Within a few hours he boards it, and heads off for America. Then as it arrives on the coast, he climbs into an experimental rocket that launches him the rest of the way. But as he approaches his final destination, his missile is noticed by American radar technicians, and they thus scramble to intercept it with a few of their own. They manage to do so, but not before the Gargoyle detaches a small capsule that he uses to land safely. Meanwhile, Rick and Banner are in a jeep, driving out to the middle of the desert, as the latter doesn't want to transform in a populated area. But they don't get very far, as the Hulk emerges while Banner is at the wheel. He obviously doesn't know how to drive, and thus crashes their jeep into some rocks. Emerging from its wreckage, the Hulk realizes that he's close to the Ross residence, where General Thunderbolt and his daughter Betty live. The Hulk is for some reason compelled to see her, and begins heading off towards their house. Rick, who'd survived the crash with only a minor head injury, pleads with the Hulk to turn around, but is ignored. The issue then shifts focus to Betty herself, who's been worrying about Banner ever since she left him. She tries to explain her troubles to her father, but he thinks that she's being hysterical, and recommends that she just get some fresh air. She agrees and heads outside, where she's met by the Hulk. But the sight of him is too much for her to handle, and she faints before he can even say a single word. Rick then catches up to him and once again begs him to leave, but is then interrupted by the sudden arrival of the gargoyle. He pulls out a pistol, but the Hulk scoffs at it, as he knows that bullets don't harm him. But the gargoyle's pistol doesn't shoot bullets, it instead fires special pellets that can turn people into mindless slaves. Thus he shoots both the Hulk and Rick, and orders them to follow him. But before we can see where they're going, the issue shifts back to Betty, who's just been awakened and been found by her father. He demands to know what had happened to her, and she simply tells him that it was the Hulk. This enrages the general, and he then swears to destroy the Hulk if it's the last thing he does. But the issue then shifts back to the gargoyle, who's forced a truck driver to take him and his slaves to the coast. As they arrive early the next morning, they're met by a group of Soviets waiting with a lifeboat, who then paddle them back to the gargoyle's submarine. Once on board, the villain, Rick, and the Hulk board a space plane that then takes them to a Russian military base. But as they're flying away, the sun rises and triggers the Hulk's transformation back into Banner. Thus when they land, the gargoyle deduces that Banner is the Hulk. But this realization deeply disturbs him, as he knows what it's like to live as a monster. Breaking down into tears, he hopelessly declares that he'd do anything to be normal again. While he doesn't expect anything to come of the comment, Banner realizes that he might be able to reverse his mutation. So he offers to help, but in exchange for their freedom. The gargoyle desperately accepts, and gives Banner his own lab equipment to work with. Thus a short time later, the American scientist has fashioned a device that successfully returns the gargoyle to normal. But now that he's found within himself a newfound courage to defy the very government that had made him a monster. So while he lets Rick and Banner escape in his rocket, he also activates the base's self-destruct sequence. Rather tragically, but also heroically, he perishes in the ensuing explosion, but in the process destroys the base so that no one else will be turned into a monster like him. That concludes The Incredible Hulk 1, and another episode of the Classic Comic Archive. But as always, I would like to offer a brief review of this issue. Overall, I thought that this was a solid introduction to the characters of the Hulk and Bruce Banner. It did a great job of establishing the two's distinct and clashing personalities, a dynamic that was ahead of its time. In the early days of Marvel, heroes were often unwaveringly dedicated to selflessly helping others. But you don't really see that here, perhaps because the Hulk didn't really do anything heroic. I'm interested to see how this changes over time, as he makes the transition from monster to hero. I'd also like to note that the gargoyle was a surprise hit for me, as I'm always a fan of villains being more than just one-note evil scientists. But in any case, let me know what you thought of this issue and the video, and feel free to suggest other classic comics for me to cover. Thanks for watching.